Okay, so in this exercise, for the first time, we're going to start to take advantage of functions. And while the final code will use functions, I'm going to sort of develop this first without a function, so we can sort of we can start to see exactly how much function or how functions can be designed almost on the fly. When we start to notice that we're essentially repeating the same type of thing, we can create a function to hopefully simplify our code and shorten it up a little bit. So in this exercise, we're going back to the previous exercise where we printed out a bunch of stars, but this time we're printing out more of a full diamond. So if n equals 4, we're still going to have 4 rows on the top. If you remember the previous exercise, we just had an increasing number of stars. Now we're going to have a number of spaces coming before the top star, right? So we have leading spaces. So on each row, we're going to print some number of spaces and then some number of stars. And the trick is going to be to of course, calculate the right values. Just like I did in the previous assignment, we're only going to do the top half first, and then we're going to deal with the second, excuse me, we're going to deal with the second part, sort of as a second problem. So the way I like to start these problems out is by getting the correct numbers to print out to the screen. So in this case, I'll start with the stars, right? So I want to print out 1, 2, 3, 4 if n equals 4. If n equals 5, I'll print out 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And then I'll move on to the spaces. So let's get the number from the user. Um, Missing parentheses. And I think it's pretty straightforward for the number of stars. Um, okay. Oops. And let's type in 5. We see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. That's good. Type in 4. We'll see 1, 2, 3, 4. Good. All right, now let's move on to the number of spaces. So if we've got an n equals 4, we're going to have 3 spaces. If we have an n equals 5, right, so we're going to have something like this. So it's 1, 2, 3, 4, one more row. And we'll just draw our space, right? And just by looking at this, and we can draw a few more examples if we need to, it looks like this is going to be n minus 1, right? If n is equal to 5, we end up with 4 spaces up top. If n is equal to 4, we end up with 3 spaces, and I'm pretty convinced that that's going to be the pattern. So we're gonna start the number of spaces at n minus 1 and count down, and eventually it should count down to 0. So right now we're looping through just with I representing the range of area, the value for number of stars. And in fact, I'm going to change this so it's a little bit more clear. So stars, right? But spaces is not really part of that. So instead, I'm going to have a separate variable, spaces equals n minus 1. I'm going to initialize it at n minus 1. I'm going to print out spaces. And each time around that loop, it's kind of implicit with stars, right? Stars is increasing by 1. But each time around that loop, I'm going to decrement spaces. It's going to decrement by 1. So I have, if we look at this, for n equals 4, I've got 1 star, 3 spaces, then oops, and it looks like I messed that up actually. 1, 2, 3, 4 would have been for the right side, but now looking at it, went a little too fast. I don't want 2 stars. I want actually 3 stars and then 5 stars, right? So in fact, my spaces is right, my stars is wrong. In fact, I actually kind of made a classic mistake. I coupled the number of rows that I'm printing directly with the number of stars I'm printing. And that was fine for the example before, but I want to kind of backtrack from that because when the user types in n as 4, I know I have 4 top rows, but that didn't really drive exactly how many stars there are. So I'm going to change this just a bit. And I'm going to start stars equal at 1. I know that the first row is going to have 1 star. I know that I'm going to go around n times. In fact, I can simplify this. So for each row in that range. And the question now is, well how many stars am I going to have? I'm going to start with 1. And if we look at this, it's not incrementing by 1, but it's incrementing by 2. Okay, so now actually, now comparing these values, here's 1 star, then 3 stars, then 5 stars, then 7 stars, and there's 3 spaces, 2 spaces, 1 space, 0 space. So I have the numbers repeating, I have the patterns coming out correctly, and that's frankly, more than half the battle. At this point, now I want to, instead of print out stars and spaces, I want to print out that many stars and spaces. So this is where functions are going to end up helping us. Let's imagine what we would do without a function here. We could do 4 star in range stars, print a star, and I don't want an end of line, so I'm going to do end equals that. And I'm essentially copying the same thing, and I'm going to print the spaces first. And at the end, I'm going to print out a new line. Okay, so if I try that, okay, so I got the answer, right? That looks good. But notice that this and this is almost exactly the same. The only difference is that, my variables are called different, but that's pretty arbitrary. And the character that I'm printing is different. Moreover, this is sort of all one unit, right? Print a line. So I'm going to break this up. I'm going to say I have an actual function that's going to print a line. And it's going to take as a parameter, if you think about every line, it doesn't matter what line it is, right? I have a certain number of spaces to print, and I have a certain number of stars to print. So let's pass that in as a parameter. Spaces, stars. And the job of print line is to print a single line, and we can do it like this. So first off, our main loop is very concise now, right? We go for every row in n, we print a line. We'll run it, make sure I don't have any errors, right? That looks good. But now let's go take this a step further and also have a print characters. And we have our character, and we have times. So times is just going to be here. We can call it I, it doesn't make a difference. And we'll print out character. And now we can just do print characters. Space, spaces, print characters, star, stars. Okay, so far so good. All right, so this is great. Now, if you're paying attention now, I had that for loop repeated twice, and I've gotten rid of that. I can actually improve this right now though, because I don't really need to print out individual characters at a time, Python has a really nice way of just printing out or creating a string concatenated multiple numbers of times by doing character times times. Okay, and so now I can replace that for loop. And notice I only have to replace it once. Now that I remembered that, right, I only have to replace that once, and that's advantage. We don't have to replace that in a bunch of different spots. Having one point of change is much nicer than multiple points of change. All right, so I've got a nice program to print out the top of that. Now let's look at the bottom. So going back to the idea of printing out the right number of stars and the right number of spaces. I know that my bottom half will have n minus 1 rows. So I'll start with that. For row, in range, n minus 1. I know that I'm going to print a line, and I'm not going to worry about how that happens because I already have a function that does that. If I know how many spaces and stars I want to print, I can pass that in. Now before I actually call that function, though, I want to print the actual spaces stars because I need to know whether that number is right, and it's a lot easier to figure it out if you're not counting stars. Just print them out. Looking back over here, spaces in the first row of the bottom is always going to be 1. It doesn't matter whether it's n equals 4. Over here we're going to end up with 1 space and then a series of x's. Right? In addition, each row is going to have 1 more space, and eventually it'll have some sort of, you know, some number, or the same number actually, eventually. So we can do spaces equals 1 and do spaces plus equals 1. Next question is how many stars we have. Well, going back here, we can actually define this rather than trying to compute how many stars should be there directly. We can find that it should have 2 less stars than it had in the bottom left half, in the top half. So I'm going to initialize stars to equal stars minus 2, or stars minus equals 2. Right? That's reflecting the fact that there's 2 fewer stars. Okay, so let's run that. Oops, I didn't update stars. Stars is 2 less every single time. Okay, let's run it now. And it looks like the right pattern. However, if I run it with 4, let's do that. I end up with 7 stars wanting to print out. And we can see that visually. And we see this shifted over. And if you're getting that, the issue is that you're printing out too many stars. You're actually printing out too many stars. I like having the numbers there because I can judge a little bit better rather than trying to line up stars on a screen. Right? I know I should have 5 stars. I know I should have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 stars, and I have 7 instead. Well, why is that? Well, the reason here is that this for loop goes around n times on that front, on that top half. I printed out 7 stars in the last row, but then I also incremented space, or decremented space, and I incremented stars. So if I actually print out stars here, after I print the line, so after I increment it, we can see that stars is 3, 5, 7, and then 9. Right? This printout is happening after the stars are printed. Right? So I print out 5 stars and then I update stars to 7. Then I print out 7 stars and I update stars to 9. So it's kind of a fluky thing, but in fact I have to compensate for the extra 2 that's been added. So I'm going to subtract by 4 instead. Now I see 5, 3, 1 in terms of the number of stars on the bottom half. I'll remove some of these printouts. I'll run my code. And now I have the answer. The big takeaway from this exercise, sure, it's important to print out the values test your code and make sure that you can find these bugs. But what's more important is that the actual program itself, once I got done with this part, I never had to think about print line again, right? I knew how to print out a single line, given that I knew how many spaces there were and knew how many stars there were. I didn't have to start kind of reinventing the wheel and rewriting for loops and worrying about that. I could just call the function. If you design your functions well, that'll pay dividends over and over and over again throughout the course of your program. As your programs get larger, you'll find yourself recalling the same functions more and more and more, especially if you design them in a reusable way. And that just allows you to work faster and faster, but more importantly, be at a higher level of abstraction and not really have to worry about the details all the time.